South Korea is scheduled to host its largest summit with Africa as 48 nations from the continent, including 25 heads of government, travel to the peninsula to talk trade, sustainability, and broader solidarity. Hello and welcome. It's the first workday for the month of June and you're watching Issues and Insiders. I'm Min Sunhee. Today I have our panel of foreign journalists here in the studio for their take on the planned Korea-Africa summit, which takes place tomorrow, that is Tuesday. For this, I have Steven Boroweic here in the studio, a writer for Nikkei Asia over in Japan, of course. Steven, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Always a pleasure.
I also have Celio Fioretti, a correspondent for Croix over in France. Celio, it's good to have you here.
Pleased to be here.
Right, Steven, the plan for a Korea-Africa summit was initially introduced by the Yoon administration back in 2022. I believe it was in November, amid its vision to become a global pivotal state. And of course, Africa's vision for the Agenda 2063. First, and Steven, how does Korea's cooperation with Africa look to support its quest of becoming a global pivotal state?
Well, I think the economies of South Korea and various African countries complement each other in some interesting ways. Just first, if you look at demographics, several African countries have some of the youngest and fastest growing populations in the world. So what that means is that South Korea is an export-oriented economy. It's going to want to have its tentacles out finding economies that are going to have vibrant consumer markets. So I think it makes sense for South Korean policymakers to be looking to Africa and saying that decades down the road, as East Asia and Europe and to a lesser extent North American economies are aging and they have a kind of shrinking consumer base, the consumer base in Africa will be expanding. At the same time, Africa has abundant stores of a lot of natural resources that are very relevant to a resource-poor country like South Korea. Things like platinum or cobalt or even just crude oil, a lot of things that South Korean manufacturers and just the country in general needs to keep things humming along. So I think this makes sense on a number of levels. I think that African countries in recent years have drawn a lot of interest from outside countries. And it's not what's kind of interesting to me is it's not the old arrangement of European former colonial countries communicating with Africa and kind of rehashing that old dynamic. It's India, it's Russia, it's Turkey, it's the Gulf states engaging with Africa in a kind of novel sort of way and engaging more as kind of peers that have potentially mutually beneficial arrangements, areas where they can capitalize on comparative advantage. And so I think that's a lot of what the heads of state will discuss in South Korea tomorrow.
Right, and amid this broader engagement with Africa, it comes amid Africa's own vision for Agenda 2063, as I mentioned to Steven earlier on. That being said, Celia, for the sake of our viewers who may not be familiar with this agenda, could you tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, so the Agenda 2063 is a set of 15 initiatives aimed to be implemented by 2063 on the African continent. They were written in 2013 by the African Union, which is a continental union in Africa, counting 55 member states, and that works to promote cooperation and development on the African continent. Now, this initiative, what are they? It covers a wide set of development projects from infrastructure to institutions. So we have to remember, as Steven said, African demographics are booming with Nigeria in the lead. Also, the economy is booming with new markets opening. So it's really the right time for Africa to make big projects, ambitious projects like this. With the Agenda 2063, we are talking about massive high-speed rail construction connecting African countries. We are talking about the third Inga Dam in Congo to produce more electricity for the region. There is also the African Free Trade Area that was implemented actually already in 2018, and the African Monetary Fund, the African Investment Bank that are currently being established. All of that and other initiatives are made to support Africa's emerging economy. It is a lot of work, that's for sure. They have to deal with major constraints, political instability and rising costs these days. But also that's the correct time for countries like Korea to help them to achieve their goals.
Right, indeed. Meanwhile, Stephen, amid the current geopolitical tensions, quite a number of pundits here in the country have been calling for the importance of better engaging with the global south, including the African continent. How do you explain these calls?
I think some of it is related to the kind of legacy of the coronavirus pandemic, in just that whole scenario kind of highlighted the risks of interconnectivity and just, when it comes to supply chains and things like that. Like, for a long time, we became very aware of the benefits of connectivity in terms of trade and movement and people-to-people exchanges. And everybody became very convinced that, like, that was a very good thing. And it is in many ways, but it also just carries risks. And I think it highlighted the importance of just having dialogue between different parts of the world, even in times of relative tranquility, when things are going well, just having engagement and being able to share any kind of concerns as they come up, not necessarily waiting until after some kind of disruption has occurred. So given the primacy of Africa in all the different ways that Celio just laid out in terms of resources and economic growth potential and all the rest, I think it just makes a lot of sense for people from different countries. I mean, we're talking about South Korea and the heads of African countries here specifically, to just sit down across from each other and get to know each other and sort of just establish kind of people-to-people familiarity and contacts. I mean, I just covered the trilateral summit between South Korea, China, and Japan last week. And if you look at the joint statement that came out of that, a lot of what the leaders highlighted was not quite so much the high political things of defense and diplomacy, things like that. A lot of the agreement was about people-to-people exchanges, particularly among youth. Like wanting to get young people to study in each other's countries and to have kind of apolitical, just people-to-people contact. And that's a way of just sending the message that we need to be concerned about the future. We want people to, have the kind of interpersonal bonds that only result from having direct contact. And I think that's a lot of what we'll see here. I mean, there are these very big geopolitical risks when it comes to climate and war and all the rest. And those are very difficult problems to solve. But like one sort of modest step toward that is to increase just having meetings and just getting together and just establishing a rapport.
Right. And for South Korea then, Celio, what broader gains does this upcoming summit look to ensure for Korea?
So there is two main aspects of gains for developing this relationship with Africa. First and foremost, the economy, of course, as we mentioned it. As I said before, Africa is an emerging market and an important one. It's 1.2 billion of people, and it will be increasing, and $2.1 trillion of consumer expenditure expected next year. Those are big numbers. And as they are developing infrastructure, agriculture, industry, there is a place for Korean companies. Machinery, tools, vehicle, they will need that to build the new Africa they want to. As well as daily consumer products too. Africa is an exporting-based country, so this is really a good deal for us. Already, Korea is increasing its trade volume with Africa, around $20 billion in 2022. Still on the economy, what Korea can gain is also a better access to resources. As Steven said, Africa is rich in resources. Every country in the world is now competing to get a safer, more direct access to these resources. As Korea is a global chip producer, they need those kind of resources, minerals, rare minerals for the chips. Already, some Korean companies are based in Africa to develop some partnership with African mines, African countries. And so this increase of developing relation with Africa is only going to help this Korean company to settle there and also invest in the local economy. Aside from the economy, there is a lot for the diplomacy-wise also. Korea has been multiplying development aid. We have seen that the goal is to become a global pivotal state. And the K-Rice Belts initiative that was launched last year is a good example of such aid program that will help to make Korea not only focused on itself, but open to the world and show that it can matter in the international scene.
Right, and staying with that then, Steven, what gains does Africa look to garner from greater ties with South Korea?
this is probably the part in the conversation where we need to just flag that Africa is a very big and diverse place. I mean, as we mentioned, the African Union has something like 55 countries. So I think, and if you look at just how big Africa is, there's a whole lot of climate diversity and resource diversity and diversity in economic development and all the rest. So different countries will have different things that they will be looking to turn their attention towards. But I would think that, and this is just my speculation, I mean, I would think that a lot of African countries, a very long-term goal for them has been establishing a manufacturing base. So much of Africa's history is the story of raw materials being taken off of the continent and turned into processed goods elsewhere and then sold around the world at higher profit margins, at profit margins that African economies have not been able to secure for themselves. In many cases, you have African consumers purchasing finished goods that are built using raw materials from Africa. And so I think African policymakers all over the continent have been thinking about this for a very long time, and South Korea has a quite instructive and in some ways inspirational story of having been a quite underdeveloped agrarian economy that took advantage of inexpensive labor and industrial policy to establish a thriving high-tech economy. And so I think the South Korean policymakers have a lot to share in that regard. I mean, I would also just mention that another area where African countries might be looking to get assistance from South Korea, both public and private sectors, just in terms of telecommunications infrastructure. You have companies like KT and wherever else who have established expertise in the setting up of cellular data networks and electrification and all other kinds of things. Just taking advantage of the kind of economic benefit that can come from instantaneous communication and just allowing people in different parts of Africa to be able to seamlessly and reliably connect with each other in this day and age that we live in. I think a lot of people would take that as a kind of granted, as something that you need for economic development. So a lot of grounds for discussion on both sides.
Right, for sure, for sure. Celio, Mauritania, it's also the co-host of the Korea-Africa Summit as it chairs the African Union this year. Could you tell us a bit about this African nation, including its ties with France, of course, and its potential collaboration with South Korea?
Of course. So Mauritania is a vast African country located on the northwestern coast of the continent, next to Mali and Senegal. Little is known about this country, but it's very interesting. While a large part of its territory is covered by the Sahara Desert, Mauritania has exceptional fish resources. On its coast live among the biggest population of fish in the world, and it represents 20% of its economy. As an ex-French colony, the relationship with Paris remains important. French is still the official language of the country, and France is the second biggest investor behind China. There is a lot also tourists from France in Mauritania. For a long time, Mauritania has been quite a fancy tourist destination for French people. Now about relation with Korea, it is interesting to note that in the early days of the Mauritania Republic, after its independence, the country was more close with North Korea. Kim Il-sung even went on a visit to Mauritania in 1975. But shortly after that, the relationship between the two soured, and the two were not in contact anymore. In the 1988, Mauritania began to look at South Korea for a new partnership. South Korea initiated talks with the Ministry of Fisheries and Ocean, of course. And since then, the relationship between the two has developed in many different occasions. Still, it's quite the beginning between the two. Only 70 Korean nationals are living in Mauritania these days, so hello to them if they're watching online. Aside from that, Yoon and Mohamed Ould Ghazouani, current president of Mauritania, have met last year in New York for a Korea-Mauritania summit. So there is a lot to do. This was the highest level meeting of Korea and Mauritania. A lot of projects to do, and we'll see how the relationship between the two can develop.
Right, and the two leaders are also meeting on the sidelines of the Korea-Africa Summit that's slated for tomorrow, of course. Stephen, the African Union joined the G20 last year. What do you believe are the broader implications of this event?
I was actually in Delhi at the G20 when they announced this, so thank you for reminding me of that. I'd kind of forgotten the moment. I remember the fanfare at the time when President Modi was embracing the African Union representative, and this was kind of hailed as a kind of overdue recognition of the importance held by Africa. And at that summit, there was a lot of talk about the global South, the increasing importance of the global South, and that it was necessary to give the African Union a greater voice in discussing a lot of these big issues. So I think you could just boil it down to say that the significance of this is that it gives the African Union a seat at the table with the world's more developed economies, and it allows them to voice their own concerns in a direct way and just have everybody else hear them out. I mean, and there's a long list of issues where Africa is really pivotal. I mean, think of migration. You know, there's a lot of migration going from the African continent towards Europe. You want to have direct contact with European countries and the source countries, a lot of these migrants, to try to figure out ways to possibly mitigate this or to regulate it or whatever it may be. There's also climate change. There's a really interesting, due to the economic disparity between a lot of African countries and the other countries in the G20, those are the richest countries in the world, there's this really interesting conversation about moving away from the use of fossil fuels. You know, you have these wealthy countries that got rich by, recklessly using fossil fuels, and in some cases, a big part of their development was using resources that they procured from Africa, and then they are now, at a time of increasing climate instability, they are telling African countries that they ought to move away from these highly polluting fossil fuels, and African countries are saying that they still need this as a source of cheap energy to fuel their own development. These are all really interesting questions, and I would say that it's a good thing probably for everyone involved that the African Union is at this table and able to communicate their own needs and their own concerns in a clear and direct way.
Right, indeed. Celio, aside from Mauritania, Ethiopia is also one of the 4 countries, African countries that is, here in Korea on an official visit amid the Korea-Africa Summit. What is little known about Ethiopia is the reality that it sent over 35,000 soldiers to South Korea in support of its war against North Korea. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Of course. Ethiopia has a long history of fighting back. Just before participating in the Korean War, Ethiopia fought tooth and nail against the Italian aggression in the 1930s, and also for its liberation during the Second World War alongside the British forces. Just a few years after being independent again, Ethiopia decided to send troops to fight alongside South Korea as part of the United Nations Command. 3,000 soldiers from the Ethiopian Imperial Guard were sent. They were the elite troop of the country, the most bravest men they have. They were part of what were called the Kagnu battalions. Arrived in 1951, they fought until the end of the war and participated in the most famous battle like Samgak Hill or Pork Chop Hill, fighting alongside American soldiers. At first, it was not easy for these Ethiopian soldiers. They were not used to American tactics, and they were not speaking English either. But still, they were recognized for their braveness and skill in combat, and they got a fearsome reputation. They quickly began to be respected, and only 121 Ethiopians were killed during the war, and they suffered no prisoner at all, which is quite an achievement in itself. After the war also, they helped to rebuild Korean cities and towns, and some of the troops stayed there until 1975. In 2022, National Assembly Speaker Kim Jin-pyo paid respect to the Ethiopian soldier that fought during the war.
Right, indeed. For it was, of course, their sacrifice that allows South Koreans right now to enjoy the democracy that we do. All right, Celio, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Stephen, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that brings us to the end of this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow. That is Tuesday.